Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Champions Summit panel on Indigenous Knowledge and Solutions. My name is Annie Doe, and I am the youth moderator for this panel coming to you from Kumi Island. This panel focuses on prioritizing Native voices and solutions first when it comes to environmental activism, because we understand and acknowledge that Indigenous people have always been and still are the most unjustly treated when it comes to destruction of land and climate. We have three speakers today who will present Indigenous perspectives on the climate crisis. And up first is Professor Dina Gilio-Whitaker, who is a lecturer at Cal State San Marcos on Native American Studies and author of the book As Long as Grass Grows. Professor Gilio-Whitaker will be exploring the historical foundations of environmental activism and indigeneity.
That's my cue? Okay, thank you. Y Pisnaxielk, Isquis Dina Gilio-Whitaker, and I'm a descendant of the Colville Confederated Tribes, and I'm coming to you right now from the traditional and unceded homelands of the Luiseño Payam people. I'm actually here on campus at Cal State San Marcos today. We have graduation, so I'm getting ready to go acknowledge our students to graduate. But meanwhile, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a quick PowerPoint to share with you. And I'm going to be giving you the, okay, come on, computer. The foundation, sort of historical foundations of climate change as American Indian people experience it. So this, I will be talking for about 10 minutes, and I'll be laying kind of the ground for my colleagues who are presenting next. So when we talk about Indigenous issues, that we need to have a framework for talking about it. And the way that we talk about it is understanding how settler colonialism frames our existence and our relationship to the settler state. But we understand this very particular form of colonialism as that which comes and embeds itself on the land and displaces American Indian people. So we say that settler colonialism is a structure. It's not just something that it happens in history, in time, but that it's ongoing. And so we say that it's a structure. It results in this structure, and its impulse is to eliminate native populations. That's what it does for 500 years. That's what this type of colonialism has done. It's predicated on the disappearance of native people so that settler populations can replace them. And it does this in a number of different ways through what the scholar Patrick Wolf called technologies of elimination. Those technologies include outright warfare, religious conversion, forced assimilation, officially endorsed policies of intermarriage outside native populations, which result in blood quantum laws. So that's where these narratives that equate culture with a requisite amount of bloods. These are blood purity tests that fundamentally are exclusive for native people. They're designed to limit the number of native people. And so all of these technologies serve to construct native people as inferior. And this inferiorizing of native people legitimizes the violent subjugation of them and the taking of their land. So this is about rationalizing and legitimizing. And it's maintained by structures, by this of the legal system. So legal doctrines like the doctrine of discovery, which is happens with the first Supreme Court decision in 1823 involving native people, constructs this idea taken from Middle Ages Catholic Church doctrine about Indigenous people, this impulse to legitimate violent takeover, and other numerous legal doctrines that construct this very oppressive legal structure is what maintains it. Secondly, we can talk about these wilderness, these narratives that construct, you know, in the American imagination, this one particular narrative that's often known as the virgin wilderness narrative. It's sometimes called the pristine myth, in which settlers imagine that they came to a virgin, unpeopled landscape, a landscape free of people. And even if there were people, they were just Indians, and Indians didn't count as more than animals to begin with. So it opens this path to, again, this legitimizing process to legitimize this violent takeover of the lands. And so there's a myth. The myth that's been constructed around this is that Native people weren't using the land according to European standards. And these are logics that get embedded into the legal system. But the reality is that Native people were actually actively managing landscapes in ways that Europeans didn't recognize. And so, so they thought that they were walking into places like this. The image here of Yosemite Valley. This is a perfect example of how early settlers that first laid eyes. There was not settlers, and no white person had ever seen Yosemite Valley until 1851 or so. And when they saw it, they described in their journals that they were walking into like a well manicured garden, but they didn't understand that it was a well manicured garden because Native people had been managing the landscape that way for hundreds or thousands of years. But they thought nature had just done that by itself magically somehow. And all of these logics find their way into the early conservation and preservation movement, thus white and settler supremacy gets baked into that, into those early movements that then become the modern environmental movement. And so these are cultural landscapes. Native people, we say that Native peoples manage these landscapes in very culturally specific ways. But Europeans did the same thing. When they came onto these lands, onto this continent, they also remade the land in their image, which was based on very, very different orientation to the world. And, you know, this is really an orientation based on exploitation and domination of the natural world. Which will be talked about shortly in the section on worldviews. And so these worldviews that Native people, that constructed Native people's relationship to the land, we call these epistemologies. These are Native ways of knowing, Native ways of interacting on the land. And they constructed everything about Indigenous cultures. And so we say that the settler colonialism, one of the things that it does as a genocidal process, and it is a genocidal process, is also epistemicide. So the displacement, the violent displacement of Indigenous peoples also results in the killing of epistemologies, the killing of these knowledge systems. So this term that we use now, epistemicide. Epistemicide happens through these technologies of elimination in the policy of forced assimilation of Native people. We see this in land dispossession. We see this in the processes of religious conversion. We see it really, especially in the boarding school system, where Native people were forced to send their children in order to break up Native families. And once they got there, their languages were prohibited, and you know, they were subject to capital punishment for that. And so this is how this process of profound domination, you know, result in these killing of knowledge systems that are inherently carried through language. And then, let's see, finally, we need to have a conversation about extractive industries and how the history of Native people's relationship to industry, especially through, the Industrial Revolution and Western expansion, results in these other kinds of processes that are fundamentally destructive. These are reflections of settler domination, the settler worldview of domination. And that it gets imposed on indigenous lands. And we can see in the histories, there's lots of things that we can talk about here, but in California, we can see it beginning with the gold rush. Well, actually, we could see it beginning with the era of Spanish colonization, with the intrusions into native lands and the missionizing process in which native people were forcibly subjected to labor processes in a slavery system to build those 23 missions. But then with the American period, the gold rush brings people, millions of people from the East Coast to claim their fortunes. This is profoundly violent for indigenous peoples in California. We also see it in the oil boom in the late 19th, early 20th century in Oklahoma with the Osages. We see it with the uranium mining in the Southwest and also the Pacific Northwest. And this is an ongoing problem because the contamination, there's thousands of mines that have never been cleaned up, so they still contaminate Native people's bodies. Also, the green rush is what's been called the green rush now. This is the cannabis industry in Northern California is having profoundly negative impacts on the land in indigenous, keeping indigenous people from their sacred sites. Things like that. Oak Flat is a copper mine that's being planned in Arizona for years. This is being rigorously objected to by the Apache people because it's a sacred site for them. And then finally, lithium mining. This is on the horizon now. This of course is green technology. This is being, green. This is really some people call it green colonialism. There's a mine planned for this area here in this image near the Fort McDermott Reservation, Paiute Shoshone people. They have withdrawn, they have registered their dissent to this project. Lithium is an extremely contaminating mining extractive process, and they will be, it's not just them, but ranchers and environmentalists who oppose this project. So these are things that we need to be aware of and part of the historical continuum of colonialism here. And that's the last slide I have for you. I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share and turn it over to, I think it's Heather's next.
Yes, thank you for sharing this history with us, Professor Gilio-Whitaker. As a student, I find that Indigenous history is far too often excluded, or even if it is included, it's diminished in American education. So thank you for speaking to us. Up next is Dr. Heather Ponchetti Daly, who's a lecturer at UCSD Muir College, who will be exploring Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge along with environmental law. So you can take the stage, Dr. Daly.
I promise you, I did try to unmute myself, so thank you. Let me share my screen. I hope, yes, I did share the right one, so. Can everybody see that? You can let me know.
Yes, we see it.
Thank you. I know I'm supposed to be an expert at Zooming now, but still. Thank you for having me today. My name is Heather Ponchetti Daly, and I am going to be talking about Indigenous approaches to climate change using traditional ecological knowledge. I teach environmental law and federal Indian policies, as well as Indigenous approaches to climate change. And while teaching these classes, I have really started realizing that many Indigenous communities, not just in America, but throughout the world, use their traditional ecological knowledge to deal with climate change. So these are key points to combat climate change. Climate change impacts are projected to be especially severe for many of the 567 federally recognized tribes in the United States that depend on the traditional places, foods, and lifestyles. Of the 567 federally recognized tribes in the United States, 40%, 229 tribes, live in Alaska Native communities. The rapid pace of rising temperatures, melting sea ice, and glaciers, and thawing permafrost in Alaska is having a significant negative impact on critical infrastructure and traditional livelihoods in the state. And some Native coastal communities are being forced to relocate to higher ground after experiencing more extreme storm surges, flooding, and sea level rise, which can impact the cultural integrity and access to vital resources. And this is actually creating climate refugees. Observed and future impacts from climate change threaten Indigenous communities' access to traditional foods such as fish, game, and wild and cultivated crop, which has provided sustenance as well as cultural, economic, medicinal, and community health for generations. But in building climate resilience, sovereign tribal nations often work with a variety of partners in innovative ways to integrate traditional knowledges with technology tools and diverse research methods to effectively address climate change and related impacts in a culturally appropriate community context. So what is traditional ecological knowledge? It is also called traditional environmental knowledge, and it's generally defined as a system of knowledge, practice, and belief that describes the relationship of living beings and their environment. This system has evolved through tradition as well as adaptive processes over time and has been passed from generation to generation by cultural transmission, even though many Indigenous cultures throughout the world have been colonized, and the whole thing that Professor Gilio-Whitaker was talking about regarding the whole societal and cultural genocide per se of these type of knowledge, this type of knowledge. So notably, there is no such thing as a singular traditional ecological knowledge, especially in the United States. Again, there are over 574 federally recognized tribes and many federally unrecognized tribes in the United States alone. And each tribal nation has its own traditional ecological and environmental knowledge. And accordingly, because of the strong connection many Indigenous communities have to a particular land and place, such communities have developed traditional knowledge for that particular place. So even though they may have been removed, they created and developed their own knowledge for this place and in time. And I want to make it clear here that to reject the stereotype that all Indigenous people live in harmony with nature, as this stereotype basically essentialized tribes and tribal people. This stereotype fits into the settler colonialism construct of inferiority.
I'm going to go ahead and go here and close the door if it's you guys. Are you good? Are you done? Yeah.
Professor Gilio-Whitaker addressed. So one of the main focuses of traditional.
Dr. Daly, you're muted.
Oh my goodness, how long was I muted?
You're unmuted now. You're unmuted now.
Okay, so one of the traditional ecological knowledge basis is Native American foods. And whether we think about it or not, one of the most fundamental ways that we interact with the natural and social world every day is through the food we eat. I mean, seriously, through this whole pandemic of COVID-19, one of the main issues was that people couldn't get together and break bread. And that goes the same for traditional ecological knowledge, that this is what happens with Native American people and their traditional foodways. There are numerous regional tribes with distinct diets, customs, and languages throughout the Americas, and many of the foods that are not indigenous to the region were spread among the different areas because of well-organized trade routes that were facilitated in part by common hand sign language used by many tribes. So it was a trade language. So there were roadways, trade routes throughout the Americas, such as you can make a comparison to the Silk Roads of Asia and Europe. And these foods would include phytochemical-rich blueberries, elderberries, chokeberries, black raspberries, blackberries, service berries, buffalo berries, cranberries, a lot of berries. And animal food products, of course, were also a major part of the Native American diet, such as buffalo and deer, elk. And seriously, I could so go for some venison right now, but unfortunately I don't hunt, so. And shawi, which for California natives is acorn mush. And this is one of the most important foods, at least for the Kumeyaay people, for thousands of years. The long process of preparing this staple food has been passed down from generation to generation. And there is actually a video on YouTube that shows the actual traditional way of making shawi, but you can probably use a food processor now, because it is a very long process of grinding and wetting and moisturizing and taking out the tannin. So it's I put that recipe in on the website for Climate Champions. Again, another staple of the foods of North America were known as the Three Sisters, and that was squash, corn, and beans. Squash, but corn and beans, they said maybe be originated in South America, but again, we're talking about these trade routes, and it eventually ended up here. And since it is a staple food for the Americas. And again, acorns were the major food product of California. Again, showing you a little picture of the Three Sisters. But climate change has exacerbated the loss of traditional foods. Fares such as salmon, shellfish, crops, marine mammals that have provided sustenance, as well as cultural, economic, medicinal, and community health for countless generations, have been compromised. Some plants used for medicines and foods are becoming increasingly difficult to find or are no longer found in historical ranges. And climate change is not the only villain here. Also is man-made, such as ski resorts and sacred areas of medicinal plants. Subsequent shifts from traditional lifestyle and diet compounded by persistent poverty, food insecurity, the cost of non-traditional foods, and poor housing conditions have led to increasing health problems in Native communities. One of these is diabetes. Climate change is likely to amplify other indirect effects to traditional foods and resources, including limited access to gathering places, hunting grounds, and environmental pollution, which Professor Gilio-Whitaker talked about regarding all the mining that is occurring, and especially this lithium mining that is occurring now on the Paiute Reservation. Key uncertainty is how Indigenous people adapt to climate change, given the resilience on local wild foods and the geographical isolation of some of these communities. For example, increased wildfire frequency and intensity due to fuel loading brought on by drought and other factors may affect tribal homes, safety, economy, culturally important species, medicinal plants, traditional foods, and cultural sites. And additionally, tribes have varying levels of preparedness, and some have limited ability to cope with extreme events. So obviously, this is a very serious problem in Indian country today. Which brings us to fire. Controlled burning by Native peoples was banned, and fire has always been a part of California's landscape. But long before the vast blazes of recent years, Native American tribes held annual controlled burns that cleared out underbrush and encouraged new plant growth. Before 1800, several million acres burned every year in California due to both indigenous burning and lightning-caused fires, far more than even the worst wildfire years today. Tribes used low-grade fires to shape the landscape, encouraging certain plants to grow both for tribal use and to attract game. The arrival of Western settlers dramatically changed the fire regime. When non-Indigenous settlers forcibly removed tribes from their land and banned religious ceremonies, cultural burnings largely disappeared. Instead, state and federal authorities focused on swiftly extinguishing wildfires. This fire suppression has only made California's wildfire risk worse. Without regular burns, the landscape grew thick with vegetation that dried out every summer, creating kindling for the fires that have recently destroyed California communities. Climate change and warming temperatures make these landscapes even more fire prone. And this was from a tribal elder. They came with their concepts of being afraid of fire. They didn't understand fire in the sense of the tool that it could be to create and what it did to generate and rejuvenate the land. So they brought in suppression. The US Forest Service infamously had the 10 a.m. policy to put out all forest fires by 10 a.m. the next day. Without regular flyers to clear out underbrush, forests quickly became overgrown, creating the conditions for the most extreme fires that we are seeing today. But recently, tribal leaders and government officials are forging new partnerships. State and federal land managers have hundreds of thousands of acres that need careful burning to reduce the risk of extreme wildfires. And most tribal nations are eager to gain access to these ancestral lands to restore the traditional burning. And since these fire suppression rules have sharply curtailed the ability of Indigenous communities to conduct traditional burns, they faced persecution and penalty if they did so on their own. But again, so since the tribal leaders and government officials are now creating these partnerships, and that's the US Forest Service, because most of these tribal lands are under federal trust protection. So in Northern California, the Karuk and Yurok tribes have partnered with the Forest Service to manage land for traditional values and wildlife management. So, and they think that, and according to Ron Good, he's a North Fork Mana, said, this is old land. It's been in use for thousands of years. And so what we're doing out here is restoring life. And by having these partnerships with the tribes, I think we can get the very frequent use of fire back in the system. So in conclusion, in the US and around the world, climate change affects Indigenous communities the most. So these are the areas to focus on climate change in Indigenous communities. First and foremost is human rights, environmental justice, tribal sovereignty, connection to the land, food insecurity or security, and traditional ecological environmental knowledge. And thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Daly, for sharing your knowledge on Indigenous food particularly. I find that whenever we connect diet to the climate crisis, we only tend to talk about agriculture and veganism, but the impact on Native people and culture is equally as important, as we all now know. So thank you for sharing this new perspective with us. So finally, we have Chenoa Musillo, who is a PhD student in educational studies at UCSD, a consultant for equity, diversity, and inclusion, and a history teacher. They will be presenting on how their fellow teachers can integrate anti-racist and decolonizing approaches to the classroom. So take it away, Chenoa.
Good morning. Thank you. So I am inspired by the two scholars who spoke before me. And really what I'm doing today, my contribution, is talking about how we get these big ideas and concepts into our classrooms. And I think that has to start with relationality, which is a core principle to Indigenous peoples, but also something that we already know has a huge impact in our classrooms. And we tend to focus on the relationship between teacher and students, but also thinking about how do we foster relationships between students, and how do we foster relationships between students and our non-human relatives and the place that we are on. So relationality, relationships beyond people connections. And so one huge reason that this is important is because oftentimes in San Diego, particularly privileged students in San Diego might not be impacted by climate change. And so building that relationship, that capacity for empathy with unseen relatives is going to help them create compassion for climate refugees and for frontline communities, but also thinking about relationship as the foundation of building empathy for the environment, for our non-human relatives, and that buy-in to climate change curriculum. So building on that is that connection to place, that relationship to place. And how can we foster that in our classrooms? in our youth created humanities content, we have which I put the link in the chat, we have the link to a really amazing assignment called Land as First Teacher that gets students thinking about how have they learned from land. And that's a tough question to get the first time. I got it for the first time in college. So really, we have an opportunity as educators to get young people forming those connections of land and our non-human relatives as people or as beings we can connect with and have relationships with. And then of course, this is going to look different based on where you are, in part because going out on a sunny San Diego beach feels different than going out in rainy Tacoma, Washington, but also because Makulahoe, La Jolla, is on Kumeyaay lands, and that decolonizing and indigenizing is going to have to be in the way that Kumeyaay people need and want it. And Tacoma, it's going to have to be the way that Nisqually people need and want it. So think about when you're moving from place to place, how you foster these relationships differently. And then knowing, thinking, and feeling. One Indigenous principle is that there is not this false binary of emotional and psychological on one hand, and on the other hand, scientific and logical, but really thinking about how in the same place, the same moment, you're making space for both critical science content knowledge or humanities knowledge. Sorry, that's me letting me know I need to wrap it up. And also students' feeling. Emotions. So asking about their feelings in response to climate change and validating those feelings. Some are going to feel numb. It's too big to take in all at once. Some are going to feel angry and sad, and modeling what that looks like for you. When I learn about climate refugees, I feel sad. I feel weight in my chest. I feel cold in my stomach, my palms. I want to make fists, right? Talking about what it feels like, because especially we know for our adolescents, they don't always know how their feelings connect to an emotion. And then also thinking about explicitly teaching how to respond. If you're watching a climate change documentary and you're starting to feel that real heaviness and it gets to the point where you need a break, what do? Do you take box breaths? Do you stretch? Do you go outside? Those things have to be explicitly taught. And so it's really important that we're marrying emotional responses to critical academic content. When we do this, when we bring Indigenous knowledge into our classrooms, we must make our classrooms safe spaces for this knowledge. So decolonizing your materials. One of the biggest mistakes I see people make is creating this dichotomy of scientific knowledge and Indigenous mythology, when in fact, there is Indigenous scientific knowledge. So thinking about just specifically the Kumeyaay, they understood for thousands of years how to leach acorns to make them edible. As one example, they had critical understanding of biology. They were able to predict weather patterns. They have chemistry understanding, and they had a really complex understanding of our expanding universe. That's scientific knowledge. And yes, it is rooted in Indigenous mythology, Indigenous stories, and Indigenous knowledge, full stop. It doesn't have to be stories on one hand that supplement our knowledge. And then using accurate language about settler colonialism. The United States government did not get land from the natives. It took it through trickery and violence. And just changing our language holds settler colonialism accountable and is an important step into preventing the ongoing process. But on that same note, it can't be the first thing that your students hear about Indigenous people. Indigenous people have been here since time immemorial. Kumeyaay people in San Diego transitioned from hunting giant ground sloth to predominantly hunting deer and rabbits to walking into the grocery store today and picking up ground beef, right? We have survived and thrived, and there are literal thousands of years of history, culture, and scientific knowledge that you can pull on before centering white settlers in that narrative. And then including that Indigenous perspective from Indigenous people, cite, get videos of Indigenous people speaking. Get your students reading Indigenous voices, not just your voice, interpreting those. So I'm going to wrap it up in 1 minute. Your classroom cannot be the most decolonized part of your life. Please let that be one of the most major takeaways you take today. If you are not doing the work to have Indigenous people in front of you, whether that's reading books or diversifying your Facebook and Instagram feed, you can't bring it into your classroom. Your students are going to know it's inauthentic. Don't oversimplify or overgeneralize, and embrace oh yao mao. That's kumiai for I don't know. It's okay not to know, but historically, misinformation about Indigenous people has been very different. Tell your students you don't know, and embrace that beautiful moment where you get to go to the Viejas website, go to the Barona website, the Sequan, the Santa Isabel website. They have information they want you to know. It's available, and your students will enjoy that process more than getting misinformation or oversimplified information about Kumeyaay people. Thank you for holding it in with me to the end. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
That was incredible, Chenoa. Thank you so much for presenting on that. And that's a great note to end this panel on. Unfortunately, we don't have any time for the live Q&A, but Dr. Daly and Professor Gilio-Whitaker have sent their emails and contact information in the chat if any of you have questions you would like to ask them. Chenoa, feel free to send your contact info as well. Thank you everyone for joining us. We're right at the end of this panel, so please enjoy the rest of the summit, and let me know if you have any more questions. I'll be here the rest of the day as well.